Winter Latina Show.
Hosted by IDM.
Hello, Nina. Как дела?
So прекрасно. Welcome to our audience of five. No, hopefully thousands are watching us right now because this is an important topic. Well, of course, all topics we discuss are by definition important. We would not be talking about trivial type of content. I'm just joking, by the way. So I'd like to welcome everyone to the first installment of the Winter Latina Show, which hopefully will be a weekly type of event that you all will look forward to. Perhaps you can even suggest topics to us later on. Yeah, leave them in the comments for sure. Would you like, Marcelo, to explain your brainchild behind the Winter Latina moniker? Because my pseudonym is Nina Byzantina, obviously, but Winter Latina sounds kind of similar. Would you like to explain your brainchild?
So yeah, this idea for those who are following the IDM, the Imprensa, it's so the idea of the channel is to construct bridges, to build bridges among peoples from all around the planet. And we're kind of doing it. I don't know how. People actually are answering the emails. It's interesting. And at some point, I started having the ideas of having weekly shows where we can discuss deeply some more punctual topics of each part of the planet as we can. So I have invited Nina to start this let's call it this show or this weekly
multipolar endeavor, right?
Exactly. This weekly attempt to bring some analysis on especially Russia and Eurasia in general, I would say. Foreign policy, actual affairs, so more or less a little bit of everything.
Sure,
so
we'd like to combine both history and current events and perhaps highlight connections between history and current events that may not be so obvious. I mean, to some people they may be. So this is the format. But why don't you explain the Winter Latina? I think that might be
at this moment. Well, I wanted you to say that, okay, but I'll say it. So a couple of months ago, I was on Twitter X, and at some point I saw a tweet from Nina saying that Slav women are no more than Winter Latinas.
Retweeting someone, reposting. Yeah, retweeting. We're not allowed to say the TW word anymore because I don't want Elon to come after us. So I'm just kidding. I'm just joking. What was the joke?
So the joke was that Slav women are no more than Winter Latinas, and that was, well, first of all, I found that hilarious. I laugh a lot about that. And then when I proposed the idea of having this show, I thought, hey, why don't we use that, the Winter Latina show? And, there was some, I don't know, should we, but, repeating time after time, we start to get caching.
Right. Yeah. We had a conversation about it in one of your previous episodes, right? So I told you about my personal experiences where perhaps I was, talking on the phone and someone who is a non-Russian, let's say an Anglo-Germanic person would overhear me. And after I hung up the phone, this person would ask, why did you argue? And I would say, I'm not having an argument. I'm just talking. Like, we gesture, we can be loud on occasion. So we kind of talked about these funny parallels between certain parallels, right? Between Slavs, specifically people of Russian descent, and Latin Americans in that regard. So we thought it would be kind of funny to actually use this, I guess, kind of a meme to apply to this context, to add a little bit of humor to, a format that would be discussing some serious subjects too. Obviously, humor helps us sort of de-stress in this context and make things a little bit less serious without any kind of disrespect. So this is basically what it means. This is the code translated for you.
And it's catchy. It's a very
catchy.
nice name. I just hope people enjoy it. I hope people give us some feedback.
They have no choice.
It's going to be that or not watch.
The authoritarian hand of the Russian has come down. This decision has been made. The Stalinist decision has been unilaterally made. There's been no choice. But exactly. Yes, let's just jump right into the topic. And why did you approached me about, the anniversary that passed last week. And there were actually two historical anniversaries, kind of sad anniversaries that passed last week, right? On the 27th of January.
Exactly. So what I was seeing around is all this jibber jabber about the liberation of Auschwitz and the end of the Leningrad siege. And what we see is that the Western media and Western leaders are just calling it, the Allied did that, or the U.S. and a lot of people sharing the picture of the movie, the Benigni movie, La Vita è Bella, and the tanks that are entering the concentration camp that he was are American tanks. And so even some friends of mine from Brazil reposted that, joking that, okay, this is 80th anniversary that the United States released Benigni.
Right.
So we decided to raise this topic because it's an important topic and it's not discussed, and we don't learn in Brazil. We don't learn, World War II history in the actual perspective. We learned the Western perspective of it. So basically the United States saved the world. That's what we learned there. And
specifically about the liberation of Auschwitz, if you've actually been, actually started paying attention to the way major politicians from US, Canada, and Europe would address the subject, it's a very solemn occasion, right? They would make this really sort of profound tweet or profound post on some form of social media or even a video, and they would routinely leave out who the liberators of that concentration camp were. At best, they would say allies. I don't think I've ever seen a case where they would actually mention the Red Army. They would be routinely called out on it by, if it's a politician who is elected, right, by their constituents, and nothing would ever change. And obviously, these people are in high levels of power. Their language is deliberate. They may be writing this type of content themselves. They might have someone else writing it for them. But the fact that they would be deliberately talking about this and leaving out the actual participants of the liberation is deliberate. And that kind of omission, right? It's not an outright lie. You're not saying that it was, the French or the Americans that liberated that concentration camp. They're just leaving out this information. So you can't accuse them of lying. But there's there's obvious, let's use a modern term, gaslighting going on in order to engage in this kind of broader context of rewriting the history of World War II, sort of undermining the feats of the Red Army, even though it's a historical consensus that between 75 to 80% of victories on the Eastern Front, you could see this in Western military historians, legitimate Western military historians' works, was thanks to the Soviet Red Army. But especially in today's conflict-ridden political context, this sort of I don't want to call it an outright battle, right, between NATO countries and Russia. This type of language is even more important, because if these politicians were to admit that even in this one particular context, that it was actually the Soviet troops that liberated that particular concentration camps, then other questions would come up. So of course, this is why they're doing it. And obviously, the final end of the siege of Leningrad, whose anniversary is on the same day, right, the 27th of January, different year, 1944. It's part of the same context, right? It's part of the greater World War II context, part of that history rewriting, part of perhaps downplaying the type of suffering that had occurred in that city, because you can go on Wikipedia, which is such a highly politicized source. I mean, we know it started up as this nice grassroots, everyone contributes history, and now it's just, it's very difficult to check history of countries that are sort of outside of the Western establishment and not see something that's, for people who actually read history, is outrageous. But even for the siege of Leningrad, you will see that it's not the longest siege, although it was quite long. It was almost 900 days, not quite. In Russian would say it's a 900-day siege. It was, 872. But you will see that it's the most gruesome siege in history, in recorded history. So that tells you something, that even Wikipedia has this type of language. Someone is probably going to jump on Wikipedia and change it now and say, no, it was actually completely fine and normal, and it didn't actually happen, and hundreds of thousands of people didn't actually die from starvation and disease. So yeah, this is why we wanted sort of to talk about those two sad anniversaries together, but specifically we wanted to focus on the siege. And that's why we have a guest expert today who knows far more than I ever will on this topic. But I'm not sure if you saw me mention this on X, i.e. the unmentionable Twitter, but when I mentioned the role, let's call it the secondary role of Finland, although not unimportant, I got attacked by saying that Finland did nothing wrong. And this is kind of a typical perception of that event, that Finland was sort of the secondary participant. It didn't really shell Leningrad. And, some people do admit that it actually did participate in the siege sort of on the north, which is the thing that actually closed that, that made the city surround it. But it's
that's
really
why it's called siege.
That's why it's called the siege, right? But it's really interesting because, it goes, and this relates to Russia too, because we can look at, the Finnish military leader Mannerheim, who was, of course, a renowned leader in the Russian Imperial Army who lived in St. Petersburg. And so there's this perception of, well, how could he have done this? He loved St. Petersburg. He lived there. He served the Tsar. And so there's also a little bit of that going on. And of course, during the Soviet period, because Finland was officially neutral, it was not sort of in the designated Cold War camp, it was kind of not appropriate to really emphasize the Finnish role in that context in the siege. So it was just kind of interesting to see how even mentioning that, people would jump at you and attack you on social media. And of course, social media is a place where everyone attacks you for wearing green apples over red apples, but it's still quite indicative. So.
Yeah, so I think we can call in our guest today, which is Alexander Shmidke. Did I pronounce it right? Hello.
Yeah, Alexander Shmidke, that's me.
Привет, Alexander.
Welcome. Привет.
Привет.
Welcome to the show. So yeah, we were just to introduce Mr. Alexander. He's a history enthusiast who's been working in translating documents from German to Russian and Russian to other languages, and also works in a guided tour around St. Petersburg for it's a specialized tour on the Leningrad siege. So please, Mr. Alexander, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, I was born and raised in St. Petersburg, so I'm a native St. Petersburger. I started doing Siege of Leningrad tours back in 2007, maybe. And, I do all kinds of historical tours, mainly focused on the history of the Second World War, but I do some tours on the Winter War. And, of course, I do all kinds of tours on the Siege of Leningrad. So, like the tours that are inside the city, telling about the lives of common people, how they survived during the siege, and the tours on the battlefields, 2 I take people to the breakthrough of the siege diorama and the battlefields of the breakthrough of the siege operation, and I take people to the battlefields of the defense of Leningrad in August, September 1941, and I even take people to the Luga line, the German bridgeheads on the Luga line that was attacked by the Soviet forces and which was assaulted by several regiments of a People's Militia Division, for example. So I do like all kinds of military historical tours in St. Petersburg.
Why don't we give them brief information about the siege so that people who are not familiar with the statistics have a broad idea, and then I think Alexander can comment on a lot of the specific details that he knows far more than I would. So the siege started officially on September 8th, 1941. It was broken through in January of 1944, and the 27th of January of 1944 is sort of the official date that we mark as the end of the siege. So the siege was, like I said, in Russian, we call it the 900-day siege. It was just under 900 days. It was 872. So the official numbers that were presented at the Nuremberg trials was 630,000 dead. And most of those deaths occurred from starvation and illnesses related to starvation. So approximately 3% died from bombing from air, like bombing from air as well as shelling. Now, other numbers have been presented as well. They're much higher, going closer to 1 million. So there's a little bit of debate, but nonetheless, even if it's the low ball number, right, the official number of 630, I mean, it's an insane number to imagine if you think about the overall population of Leningrad, which I believe was about 3 million at the time. Alexander can correct me if I'm wrong. And during this time, approximately 50% of the population was evacuated. So that's a huge number, 1.5 million people. And there were 3 waves of these evacuations. Obviously, a significant percentage of them were children. Now, lots of people did not want to leave. This was their home. We can, maybe without jumping directly into historical parallels, we can think about a certain conflict unfolding in the Middle East. And we know that people there also do not want to leave their homes because they're their home. So you can kind of, again, think about current conflicts and bring yourself back in order to understand what was happening a little bit better. Now, obviously, because this is a large city and it was fully surrounded, supplies were a huge issue. So at one point in the siege, the lowest rations for people who were not engaged in physical labor was about half a pound of bread for the whole day, so 125 grams of bread. It was double that for workers. Now, of course, this wasn't just delicious bread. It was bread with all kinds of sketchy additives to increase the volume and basically the weight. So you can imagine the kinds of things that would have been added there. So during the siege, people ate all kinds of things they could get a hold on, right? So they would eat glue because it would have certain animal parts in it from hooves. They would eat grass when it came out. They would eat other things, basically anything and everything they would get their hands on. So nutritionally, this was obviously very, very sketchy. And the first winter was terrible because the temperatures were very, very low. I think the lowest temperatures were below 30 degrees Celsius, so that's lower than -20 Fahrenheit. And the average was about -18 Celsius, so about 0 Fahrenheit. So you can kind of imagine with the bombings, the bomb shelters, the shelling in certain parts of town, and the lack of food, what the overall social mood was like in the city and what just daily life was like, right? Even in terms of transportation, in terms of daily nutrition, and things that, we take for granted. So that's my little bit about the general statistics. Now, let's have Alexander talk about some more specifics. I think to me, the most interesting thing that Alexander does is oral history and engaging in people who survived the siege and who are still around to remember and to document their memories, because obviously in historical periods that are removed, several centuries, we don't have that option of interviewing people. I mean, we might have diaries and journals and that type of content, but this is people whom we can interview today. So as far as my own personal interest goes, that's kind of what I like to see in Alexander's posts about this topic, but obviously he does far more than that. So, Marcelo, what would you like us to address?
Yeah, please, Alexander, explain a little bit how the tool works, how your research works, how your work overall. How do you do this? What's your what pushes you to do it? What's your passion about it? Please just and then explain us everything that's relevant for the siege, of course.
Well, I get generally asked by people whether there was some personal connection that's like pushed me into this whole sphere of researching the siege of Leningrad or the history of the Great Patriotic War in general. And I have to say that just until like maybe 2 years ago, I had no clue that my grandmother lived in the city during the siege of Leningrad. And I had no clue that my grandfather was actually drafted in the army on the 22nd of June, 1941 in Leningrad as well. So I had no idea, and I think it's good in a way. I think it's the whole situation is that I managed to approach it without any kind of personal bias. I saw the situation as it was, without any filters and without any personal filters, and I was inspired and awed by this whole tragedy that's unfolded in front of me when I read the books. It's like like when people ask me, like, is there any probably it was some personal connection that made you get interested in that, and I say, well, there's a movie about the fall of Troy, that was filmed in the early 2000s, and a lot of people watched it all over the world. I mean, of course, they were like great actors and directors, blah blah blah. I mean, they let's take this for granted, but still, there's no personal connection for anyone all around the world with Troy, because these people are long dead, and so this happened many years ago, like 2,000 years ago, like almost 3,000 years ago. The very story, it's so engrossing, it's so grand, it's grandiose that it completely overwhelms you. And once you look into it a little bit deeper, without the cliches that unfortunately were forced upon very many people in the Soviet period for like certain ideological reasons, you just feel that it's something worth studying. I'm not speaking of any practical lessons, like life lessons. I'm just speaking about the whole grand tragedy unfolding in front of you when you start researching it. And this is the same thing that drew people towards films or books telling about great events of the past, like this very movie about Troy, for example. Mm-hmm. So this is it. This is what probably sucked me in a way.
That's pretty nice. That's true. What you mentioned there is very interesting indeed, because we all, most of people around the planet probably saw at least in the western side of the planet, saw the movie Troy, and everybody, it's happy and it's sad and have all these mixed feelings about something that maybe it's not even well documented. I mean, it's just a Hollywood production. It's nice. It's okay. I like movies. I like action movies. I'm not here to say bad about that. But there is not this connection. And what to do, and you didn't find by the time that you had a personal connection, while most of Russians probably have some personal connection to at least one big event during World War II. And but you didn't know, and then you found out that you actually have this personal connection to the event. But why did you see? How do you see this as so grandiose? What was the reason that sucked you exactly about to the Leningrad siege?
Well, you see an enormous city being surrounded by enemy forces who want to completely annihilate everyone in the city, not so much by bombs and shells, but by starvation. And this was a deliberate act. It wasn't just like something taken like on a whim. It was very deliberate. It was practically one of the greatest planned genocides in human history. It wasn't these ideas were not completely brought to life, thankfully, but the plan was to completely exterminate nearly 3 million people, which were encircled in this ring of the so-called ring of the siege, that were inside of these encirclements, because by September 1941, there were approximately 2.5 million civilians and about 500,000 soldiers inside of this ring, and their surrender did not have to be accepted, even if it had been offered by the Soviet side. So basically, there was no choice, absolutely no choice for the people encircled within the siege, but to resist and to win, because, death was the only other option. And imagine like a huge city, one of the greatest cities on earth, with all these beautiful architectural ensembles, with all these grandiose buildings being pounded by artillery and air bombs regularly, with a clear intent not even to beat people into submission, as it was Hitler's intent towards London, for example, but it was to completely eradicate all life in the city. Mm-hmm. And of course, this is something, I would say, inspiring in the, like when I speak of awe is in the ancient sense of this word. It inspires fear and respect. The whole idea that this city resisted this evil intent, and it managed to persevere throughout all these years. This is something that's, leaves me with bated breath like this.
I think we again, back on social media, we talked a little bit about all the historical photographs of the type of architecture that Alexander mentioned, right? Beautiful buildings, historical buildings, and then people pulling corpses of their loved ones that are wrapped up, right, on sleds in winter. There's even a painting that I shared of a survivor painter who essentially saw one of these scenes through his window. And so that's kind of one of the most iconic, I guess, in the negative sense, contrast, right, between this beautiful city, right, that is much of the architectural work. Some of the architecture looks more European, quote unquote, air quotes, and then you have people who are barely moving, right, in the dead of winter in minus, 1 billion degrees. I'm obviously exaggerating, and they're pulling their loved ones on sleds to the nearby cemetery because they can't get there in any other way. So that contrast is extremely shocking. I mean, even today. But of course, again, we can bring ourselves and compare it to some modern conflicts that we see unfolding today. So.
Yeah, one of the things that I found very interesting just before we come live, we were chit-chatting about the importance to understand the grandiose of small heroes that did this and that and why. And could you tell me a little bit more about that these particular cases and the difference between a very detailed tour and the average tourist guy, the average tourist course that we do, even I do when I go around. I mean, sometimes you have a day to do everything, and you just okay, done, check, seen, good.
Well, yeah, there's speaking of military history tours in Russia, there's a big problem with kind of offering or like marketing them to Russians, because up until the COVID time, I used to do tours almost exclusively, like Siege of Leningrad tours, almost exclusively to the foreigners. And I'm speaking of battlefield tours, not telling about what happens inside the city, but what happens over the course of the major battles around it. And they are practical. They have the very concept of military history tours, so battlefield tours, is pretty much unfamiliar to most Russians. Well, I would correct myself. Not so unfamiliar, but it was presented in a very, very different, and I would say in a very, very wrong way in the Soviet period, because it was not what they did back then when they took school kids on a battlefield tour. It was not a military historical tour. It was a memorial tour. So basically, it was more of a ritual memorial trip. They would take them to some monuments on the battlefield, and they would say, okay, there was a big battle here. There were lots of heroes, without going into any detail. Let's be proud of our heroes. Okay, that's great. We visited this great place. Now let's go back to school. And this Soviet tour guide would mumble something under her nose about the great communists who did great things to save the country, and we're all obliged to the Communist Party because it saved us all from this great peril, and blah blah blah. And that's how it was in the Soviet period. The approach did not change a lot after the fall of communism. They just left out the Communist Party part, but everything else remained the same. So let's come here. That's where our great ancestors fought and died, and let's go back. Proper military history tours do exist in Russia, but unfortunately they are attended by only by basically nerds, like the people who are very deep into that, and they are normally conducted by hardcore nerds who would go into all the fine details without trying to involve even a little bit of drama, without trying to present the cases of heroism and everything in a proper way, fitting, dramatized way. I'm not speaking of something fake, but I'm speaking of describing it and creating the atmosphere, like forming a narrative. They would do this rather dryly, they would go into very technical details, and legitimately such tours do exist in the West as well, because there are also like groups of hardcore nerds who just want this technical information. No problem with that. But anyway, there's just a very minuscule amount of Russians who want to visit such tours. And when you try to invite people to go on such tour, and they would say yeah, been there, done that. They will tell us, they will bring us to some memorial, blah, 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 some basic things about communism and great heroes. Okay, we've seen that. No, I'd better go to some palace and see another Fabergé egg or something like that. Yeah, so there's a problem. Even when I approached a tour company, and not just one, and I said, I suggested them to post my tour on their website. They said, yeah, fine, let's do it. And when I looked at the website, they said that the tour, the title read, Military Patriotic Tour. I said, sorry, but I wrote military historical tour. I have nothing against patriotism, but it's got to be a military historical tour. They said, just shut up. This way we can sell it to school kids. And this is where here we go again. So they market my tour as this standard blah 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 Soviet kind of tour that goes to all these standards, that does all this standard routine. And as people do not know anything better, they request these tours for school kids. So just inculcate them with patriotism, tell them that we had great heroes. But the problem is that this is not the proper way to inculcate people with patriotism. People gets this whole idea when they have the understanding what really happens, when you explain to them in vivid and clear detail how a particular heroic feat was performed. And in this case, they would really get it. They would remember it. You can't do it with all these vague phrases and general lines about great heroes. Well, that's it. That's the way it works in Russia.
I have a question. So when you worked as a tour guide for Western tourists, first of all, where were the tourists from, and did they have a specific interest in the topic of battle tours, and what was their reception like?
Well, like when it's much easier for me to work with American or British tourists just because they have the common understanding of what a battlefield tour is, and what I offer to them is exactly what they expected. Right. So it's a tour to the battlefield. You tell them that's where this unit was, that's where this man was when he saw a German tank and he shot up this tank from this particular trench and the tank approached from that side. You just recreate the whole situation to them. And this is the way it works in the West, generally. I mean, of course, there are like better tours, there are worse tours, but generally that's the way it is. And mainly the tourists were from the United States. There were lots of tourists from Britain because it's pretty common for the British people to go to Belgium, for example, or to France to see the battlefields of Verdun or Somme, Ypres, and other battlefield sites. There are even people who go to different countries on a kind of a battlefield tour pilgrimage, or like they see battlefields all around the world. For example, I once met a couple that took battlefield tours in Southeastern Asia, in South Africa, well, of course, Europe, and all the places around the world. So they went when they came here, like they knew what to expect, and that's what I delivered to them.
Would you say the people were fairly? I mean, I understand the expectation. Would you say they were fairly knowledgeable about the events? Or were they kind of coming in with a blank slate and they needed to have?
No. Some people actually came like without any particular knowledge about the siege. But in order to bring people to a tour, it's much more important to kind of for them to have certain expectations about the form of the tour rather than the content of the tour. Because in Russia, people have very little idea about the form of the tour, how it's going to work for them. And some people. Well, of course, the people who came on my tours, they had some idea about the siege of Leningrad, some general idea. And naturally, they thought, okay, there was the siege of Leningrad. Naturally, there were some battlefields around here. Okay, let's book a tour to the battlefields, because that's we know what a battlefield tour is. In Russia, it just doesn't work this way.
Sure. Would you say their perception after the tour was one of being horrified, impressed? What was the reaction?
Well,
because I know you're not just doing, like you're saying, you're not doing, as you said, a nerd dry tour of just completely technical information. You're putting it in context. At the same time, you don't want to overly dramatize, right? You want to keep it as factual as possible. So, which to me is, real history. This is how you do history. So what was the perception after the tour?
Well, I would say that the overwhelming majority was thoroughly impressed. I mean, of course, I'm flattering myself, but I would say that it's not just about me.
I mean, I'm not questioning your skills. I know you're very skilled, but in terms of just the event itself, like you're saying to you, the reason you got into this was because it's awe-inspiring in the old sense of the word awe. What was their perception of the event, of the siege, of the battles like? I'm just curious about foreigners, not Russians.
Well, I was saying that they were overwhelmed with the scope, with the general scope and scale of what really happens here, with the ferocity of battles that raged around Leningrad, and they saw all these battlefield relics right in front of them. They saw the trenches. They heard the stories of sacred sacrifice, and they heard the stories of heroism. And this was pretty, I would say, inspiring again.
Was there any specific story of a battle or an individual that impressed them the most? Let
me think about it. Well, I told them the story about the pilot Peluta, for example, who escorted a group of 9 passenger airplanes, like transport airplanes, like they're called Li-2, or like the American C-47. You can see these planes on all footage, on any footage of the D-Day landings, for example. It's like it was a Soviet copy of the American C-47, and 9 such planes carrying nearly 300 children had to fly from Leningrad to the mainland across the German, not German controlled territory, but the territory that the Germans could easily, where the Germans could easily intercept them with their airplanes. And it just happened the way that he was the only plane, the only pilot escorting this large group, and he noticed a group of 6 German Messerschmitt planes approaching. So he decided to go berserk against them, and he started flying up to one plane after another, strafing them without following any rules of air combat, just to distract them. And it was like an act of crazy self-sacrifice. And the Germans naturally switched all of their attention to this lone plane, which allowed these 9 planes with kids to continue to their destination, and they were not intercepted. So, but his plane was naturally shot down in this like crazy dogfight. The Germans got so angry with missing their like easy prey, so they started circling around him and strafing his airplane with their machine guns. He climbed out of the cabin and like hid under the plane's wing, and the debris, the chips from the wing of the airplane, so that were like shot off by the bullets that the Germans fired. They started hitting him, and he was like, when he was taken to a hospital, they found 23 injuries on his body. He barely made it alive. I mean, he was lucky enough to that he was found by accident by some peasants who rode not far from there on his sleds, and he noticed this plane, and he approached the pilots and picked him up and took him to the nearest hospital. And he managed to recover and continued his service. So he was awarded the title of the Hero of the Soviet Union for this. And I show, like, when I tell about this, I show like such passenger plane in the museum of the Road of Life, for example. I tell about the people who charged into completely hopeless infantry attacks against well-fortified German positions. I don't know, if this could be exactly interpreted as heroism, because people might have different points of view, on that, because it might be more like the fault of their commanders. But it's when I tell this to the Brits, for example, it feels very close to their heart, because this is pretty much like the first days of this Battle of the Somme, when like 15,000 Brits were killed in a single day, and there was quite similar World War I style infantry attacks against German trenches in a vain hope to break through the siege in November 1941, when the situation for the city was getting not just critical, it was getting catastrophic, like this. So that's the kind of stories that I tell them, and maybe this is where they were, I don't know, impressed or horrified or
of course, there's a certain empathetic connection, right, when you hear such details. Can you tell a little bit about the Road of Life? We haven't actually mentioned it in my little summary, so if you can sort of explain to the audience what the Road of Life was.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a little bit difficult to do without a map, but just generally speaking, the city was surrounded on land from 2 sides. So the Finns came from the north and the Germans came from the south, and the Baltic Sea was in the west, and naturally both the Finns and the Germans completely controlled the Baltic Sea. So the only way to deliver supplies was across the Ladoga Lake, and the problem was that there was no logistical infrastructure on the lake whatsoever. There was a tiny little strip of land of coast of the Ladoga Lake coast to which Leningrad was connected by a single railroad. And this railroad was before the war, it was used to deliver peat from peat fields, like as fuel for some of Leningrad's power stations. And it was meant to, there were a few passenger carriages, and they delivered people to their dachas, summer houses. That's it. Like a small, sleepy railroads, like in a very poorly developed region, like to the east of Leningrad, which is maybe like 30. So the Ladog Lake is about 40 kilometers to the east of Leningrad. And that's it. The road led to a single fishing village, where there was just one lighthouse and one pier with half-rotten wooden planks. That's it. And the Lake Ladoga itself is extremely dangerous for navigation. There are lots of shallow places, underwater rocks, and underwater currents, which suddenly starts steering your boat to these underwater rocks. Basically, when Peter the Great founded St. Petersburg, he lost 100 ships during the first winter on this lake. And over the next 15 years, he started losing 1,000 ships every year, because of this, because of the weather and like the weather conditions on the lake. And that's why he ordered to dig the longest canal in Europe, going from the river Volkhov to the river Neva. The Volkhov River goes further inland. And this canal was only meant to bypass this highly dangerous lake. So I'm just describing this to give an idea of how dangerous it was to cross the lake, because when the Germans approached Leningrad, they cut off a part of the canal. So the canals were like rendered useless, and they controlled one of the banks of the Neva River. So basically the safe route for the ships was cut off, and the supply relief to Leningrad was basically meant to use old barges, whichever barges they found on the lake, whichever barges were there at the very moment, and they had to sail across the highly dangerous lake. It's like 105 kilometers route, across the highly dangerous lake, in the season of storms that started in September 1941, under German bombings, they had to sail towards the ports that did not really exist. And all these goods had to be transported by these tiny railroads, where there are just a few little weak train engines with a few carriages.
How was the road of life used to evacuate civilians out of the city?
Well, at first they tried to evacuate civilians by boats. When there was the navigation season was still like in September and October, all the way up to mid-November, and they tried to evacuate them, but there were lots of catastrophes on the lake, because they could not take strong ships with metal hulls from Leningrad to the lake, and whatever they could use on the lake were old barges. Like, for example, on September 17th, 1941, the largest catastrophe on the lake took place when a barge, an old cattle freighter, loaded that was boarded by 1,500 people, was destroyed by a heavy storm. So basically, it's just split apart in the morning on the 17th of September, and several hundred people were washed away by huge waves immediately. The others tried to fight for their lives, but it was in vain because no help was coming. The commander of the tugboat, which towed this barge, managed to get about 200 people on board, which was like an incredible feat, because the boat is really tiny. I have no idea how he managed to get back to the ports. It was a miracle. He was awarded the Order of the Red Star for that later, but he could not save everyone, because the people were scattered by huge waves almost immediately, and the bodies of most of them were never found.
Right. And this is why I think it's interesting when we look at the statistic, which I believe is, like I said, it's about 1.5 million people that were evacuated. When you think about the conditions, right, your description of this air rescue of the children, right, being evacuated through the distraction of a pilot that just, like you said, went berserk and miraculously survived using this insanely dangerous waterway. So I think that really puts things into perspective when you think about the numbers, right, of people who are actually able to leave, just the extent of physical effort and the power of their spirit that went into being able to leave. So, again, it's just really remarkable to me. And I'm not a specialist in this field.
And that was just during the navigation seasons, because when the lake got covered with ice, they had to transport people by trucks. And on the open expanse of the lake, the wind is not stopped by any natural barriers. So it starts getting so strong that it chills people to the bone within minutes. And in December 1941, when the trucks was loaded with people started finally going across the ice, when the ice became kind of strong enough to carry at least a truck with several people in it. There was no mass evacuation at the time because the Germans still controlled the only railroads which connected the other side of the lake to the mainland. Okay, without the map, it's hard to explain, but they loaded a truck bed could fit from 8 to 12 people approximately. And I've spoken to a guy whose grandmother worked as a medic in Cabona. That's the final destination of the trucks. So there's a 30-kilometer icy expanse of the lake, and they started on this side and they ended in Cabona on the other side of the lake. And according to her, when trucks arrived there after driving 30 kilometers across the ice, out of 8 or 12 people who were inside, in the truck beds, only 3 or 4 were alive. The others were frozen corpses or sometimes ice-covered statues. Right. And it was only in mid-January that they managed to put tents on the lake, and trucks drove from one tent to another. They drove for 10-15 minutes. They stopped there. People could go inside the tents. They could get warmed up by the stove that they put right in the ice, and they were given a little bit of food and hot tea, and then they continued going. So over the course of the evacuation across the ice, from the 22nd of January 1942 to the 20th of April 1942, when the ice started cracking, about 530,000 people were evacuated. How many of them died is still not known exactly. There's no single scholar who could give you an exact figure, but I think the modern historical consensus is about 20%. So more than 100,000 people died during this winter evacuation.
Right, which of course, doing exact statistics during wartime is difficult for obvious reasons, but in a case like this, it's even more challenging. Under such dire conditions. I have a couple more questions, Marcelo, but I don't want us to be here for 2 hours, so you let me know. Can't hear your mic.
I'm sorry. Sorry.
There we go.
I had some complaints on the chat that the sound was not arriving. So as I told you, all the magic happens here, and I call it nightmare. So no, I have one question from the chat. If the sound was not okay, it's all right. It's being recorded. I repost it later. Mm-hmm. So I have a question from the chat here that was a bit long time ago already, but the question is if this is true that due to new studies, the number of victims, total victims of World War II, Russian victims of World War II, are raising to a level of 45 million. And I have to say that I have heard this before with some analysts like Larry Johnson. I mean, but the official number is still around 27, right? But
whom are they counting? Because the question is if they're counting combat casualties, and they're counting civilians. I think this is where the challenge would lie. But I haven't personally heard such a high number. I mean, 27 million is kind of difficult to comprehend to begin with. And there probably is some variation, like I said, because it's very difficult to do exact estimates with war statistics for several reasons. But Do you know where? Did they say what the source for that was?
No. It's just it's just a question from the chat. As I've heard that, so that's me gossiping around here. I've heard some analysts saying that new studies can not exactly go up to 45, which is
it's a significant raise. So I'm just kind of wondering, what is it?
And even considering the fact that Russia today is about 160 million, right? So today,
a little bit. I think it's closer to 145, 150 or so.
Around that. So raising to 45 million, it's like a third of the population.
Well, obviously the Soviet.
But I don't know.
The Soviet population was much larger. I personally have not heard such a high number. How about you?
This number of 27 million was established by the commission led by General Krivosheyev in the early 1990s. And it's coming under increased doubts and attacks from modern day historians, and maybe deservedly so, because there were certain gaps and omissions in the study. But so far, no one has presented an authoritative and comprehensive study on the losses of the Soviet Union during the Second World War. So there are guesses, there are certain bits and pieces of analysis, but so far I haven't seen any great tome that would completely subvert the methods and approaches of Krivosheyev. Maybe it's in the works somewhere and some historian is preparing it, but so far the generally accepted number is 27. But once again, it's quite possible it will be reviewed and yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I had two questions, Marcelo. Is that okay for me to ask?
Go ahead, please.
So I would like to go back to the question of oral history, because sometimes you deal directly with survivors of the siege who were children at the time. I just wanted to learn a little bit about your impressions of interacting with them, what your sort of objective is to interacting with them, and just an overall impression. Did you hear me? Did you catch me? Can you guys hear me? Can you hear?
I can hear you. Alexander, do you hear?
I think you asked Marcelo about that, or me.
No, I asked you. I asked you when you deal with oral history.
I have very little information to provide.
Yeah, sure.
So when you interact with survivors who were children, right, at the time, and they're quite, they're seniors these days, what is your objective and what are your impressions?
Well, I would say that I haven't spoken to that many siege survivors, because I normally do this kind of bookish research, focusing on documents, certain articles I find online or books. But I've spoken to several siege survivors. I can't say that they told me horrifying stories, but it depends on one's perspective of what's one considers horrifying. Because, for example, one old lady told me about her experience during the winter of 1941-1942 when she was evacuated across the ice, and she doesn't really remember the evacuation itself. And not a lot of people really remember the evacuation, because it was such a horrifying moments that some people probably chose to forget just maybe subconsciously. And but she told me about how she lived with her mother, and it was really cold in their room, and they slept together in the same beds in order to warm up each other. And she told me that she woke up one morning and she saw a tear that was frozen on his mother's cheek. And then her uncle helped her drag her mother's body to the side of the room, and it stayed there for a couple of weeks because they kept using her mother's rationing cards to get bread. They did not report her death to the officials. Mm-hmm. So yeah, for a 4-year-old girl, seeing the dead body of her mother in the corner of the room was pretty much something And then this lady also told me that she was evacuated. I think it was March 1942. She was evacuated to the south of Russia, to some little village near Krasnodar. And it was occupied by the Germans. So she was occupied by the summer. They brought, that's how she described the whole process of adoption, or like temporary adoption of little kids. They took the orphanage, because she was like all alone. They took the orphanage to this village. They brought her and the other little kids to the market square. And it was like, picking up kittens, free kittens from a box. That people would put somewhere in the streets. People from different families and houses approached little kids and took them to their houses. And she stayed in this house for a month or two, and then the Germans came. So she escaped from Leningrad only to fall under German occupation.
And she survived both.
Yeah, she survived them both. She said there were different Germans. There was one German who gave candies to little kids, and she said like there was another German when one little boy approached the Germans who were sitting in some village barn, or like village hut, and he asked them for something. I think he asked them for bread. And then a German soldier decided to prank on him or something. So he took a kettle with boiling water and poured it like over him. The boy shrieked with pain and ran away. So it was that like her childhood impression. So when they were liberated in February 1943, she said like they were like overjoyed and ran up to the soldiers who entered the Soviet soldiers who entered the village. And then she made this long way back home. A lot of people had pretty big difficulties getting back to their native apartments, native homes, because some of them were destroyed. Some of them had people moved into them by the authorities, and it was quite difficult to litigate for the return of their apartments. And for example, in 1946, in the first months of 1946, there were like nearly 50,000 lawsuits filed by the people who returned back to their homes, only to find them occupied by some other people. So it was another kind of
like absolute chaos. Well, it's interesting to me because I know my father's grandparents lived in outside of Bryansk, which is in a village, which is in Western Russia. So that part of Russia was under occupation pretty early on. And whenever I would ask my dad, this is so interesting, what impressions, how did they talk about the occupation? And he would always say they refused to talk about this altogether. This was just not a subject they wanted to discuss. So to me, it's interesting how it's not always easy to get that kind of oral history from people, because like you're saying, they either have forgotten because of human psychology, or they would rather not remember things perhaps that were quite awful. So, that's one of the reasons why I was asking you the extent to which they wanted to share this type of information. So, and to me, obviously, I've never interacted with these survivors, but there are a lot of testimonies online. And of course, the one about the, dead body of a mother with a frozen tear is very shocking. But the ones that I find almost more shocking are the way they talk about daily life, where, they would talk about like, well, of course, my grandma was, she was making glue for us to eat, right? Because it had some animal parts in it. And they talk about it very matter-of-factly, like this is a completely normal thing to do, is to cook glue and then to consume it to get some kind of basic nutrition from these animal parts. So to me, that's sort of very subtle normalcy that, well, of course, everyone did it, right? So there are no qualifiers when they talk about this. They talk about it as just fact. Like, we just did this thing. Like, oh, I went to the grocery store. Like, oh yeah, my grandma cooked some wood glue and we ate it to stay alive. So to me, that's almost more shocking. That sort of everyday lifestyle changes that people had to make and the way that these survivors perceive them, that, well, everyone did this. This was completely normal. So that's my perception. I guess my other question was, what is your, I don't like using the term favorite because this is a horrible event, but what's the most interesting, fascinating event, story, person, place from you studying the overall siege or the battles? I know it's kind of probably difficult to choose one, but I'd like to hear it.
Well, I don't know. That's super difficult. But speaking of battlefields, there's one battlefield that I've already mentioned, the Luga bridgeheads, and it's practically totally ignored by all tour companies because it's located within a 2 hours driving distance from St. Petersburg, and few people really want to go there. But that's the place where Leningrad was saved, because when the Germans captured the bridge across the Luga River, there was pretty much nothing kind of blocking their path to Leningrad. And they were, on the 14th of July, they were within 80 kilometers away from Leningrad as the crow flies. Let me, just a second, I need to switch my devices because my battery is running low on my phone. Let me try to use my tablet. Just a second. I think it's
no worries. Well, Marcelo.
Just a second. Okay, let me turn it off.
So Marcelo, are you learning a lot? Are you? Uh-oh, your mic is off.
I'm sorry, I have to rewatch it later because
He's back?
I'm going crazy here with the technical stuff. But yeah, I have some, okay, do you have him back? Yeah, he's back.
He's back.
Yeah, can you see me?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can see you.
Hear you.
Let me just call you back here. Okay, there you go. Okay.
Yeah, so what I just started speaking about, and the Germans made a sudden tactical maneuver that nobody really expected, because they managed to traverse very difficult terrain for tanks and just any kind of vehicles within the span of a day and a half. So they made a sudden turn to the north of the Luga line, which is closer to the Gulf of Finland, and they managed to capture a bridge with the use of their super secret saboteur team, the Brandenburg 800, who presented themselves as Soviet soldiers and captured the bridge completely intact. And like I said, there was nothing that really blocked their paths towards Leningrad. And this was this happened at midday on the 14th of July. And 12 hours before that, the 2nd People's Militia Division boarded their trains, and it was sent to a nearby town, not far from this bridge was captured. The problem with the People's Militia Division that was extremely poorly trained and led. Out of 8,000 people who joined this People's Militia Division, I mean like all volunteer division, only half was trained to use rifles and machine guns. So I read their memoirs, and they said that like some of the memoirs read like we were like charging at the Germans across the battlefields, and the soldier next to me asked me how to reload the rifle. And so like 4,000 had very little idea of them, had very little idea of how to use like basic like weapons. It was the problem, you know, like maybe you've heard about the issues with Red Army commanders by the beginning of the Second World War, when after the purges of 1937, there were very like few skilled commanders. But so while the regular army had issues with skilled commanders, the volunteers had basically no one skilled to lead them at all, because the army has like a cadre reserve for any future conflict. For example, they know that if a war starts, we'll call up like a professional retired colonel, or like we'll call up like a major, you know, to lead a division or a regiment. There was no planned reserve for the volunteer divisions, and the guy who led this division he used to command a battalion which is like 400-600 people. He distinguished himself during the Winter War, and he was awarded the title of the Hero of the Soviet Union. And they told him, like, good job, man, like we'll send you to like commander's courses. He started half a year at senior commander's courses. Then he went sick, and he was in the hospital for half a year, and then he only had 2 months of experience as a division commander. at the post of a deputy commander, so not really the proper division commander. So basically, it's he was like sent to a much higher level without any kind of experience. So, but sometimes when you have like a commander who doesn't really know what to do, like an official, you have his deputies who sometimes tell him like what to do. Somebody to give him proper advice. There were 3 regiments in this division, and the commander of the first division was a major of veterinary service, like basically animal training service. The second commander was a technical major, like who specialized in technical things, but not commanding troops on the battlefields. And the commander of the third regiment was the head of the military training departments at the university. So none of them had practical experience of leading soldiers on the battlefields. And I'm speaking about the senior commanders. All junior commanders, like sergeants, were political officers or political workers who worked at different factories. That's it. They were just like members of the party, but not. They didn't have any proper experience. All they knew about fighting in the war was what they saw in the movies, like all the other regular people. They just had certain like authority, but nothing like in terms of military experience. So this division was sent to this far away, like godforsaken parts of the front where nothing serious was supposed to happen, because all around there were like bogs and forests, and no one expected the Germans to break through there. They were sent there just maybe to secure rear areas, because like no sane person, even the Germans were surprised by this order that they would be sent way further north across bogs and forests. And this division arrived to a station 15 kilometers away from where the Germans captured the bridge. They got unloaded in the morning, and there was like idling around there. They just scattered around because, like there was no proper leadership, and they couldn't just, put them all together. And so the Germans captured the bridge at 12 a.m. and at 12:07, one of the soldiers who survived, the German soldiers, the German saboteurs, managed to run up to like a nearby telephone and phone to the station, telling them that the Germans captured this bridge. The Luga River is no more of an obstacle for German tanks, and that Leningrad could be captured within 2 days. And after that, all these untrained volunteers had to face the vanguards of the 6th Panzer Division, which had 2 years of fighting experience. That was at the peak of its military form. Over the 7 days of intense fighting all around these bridgeheads, the division lost from 1,000 to 1,200 men killed or missing in action, which is pretty much like killed. But they managed to stop the Germans literally with their bodies. The Germans did not manage to expand any further from this area. And this is pretty much an all-inspiring story of self-sacrifice. I mean, of course, one can speak a lot about the poor command and control, that the volunteers were not supposed to be there, that probably with hindsight, they should have sent a proper military division. But, like it's all hindsight is 2020, This is like when, when you speak of all these party officials who were just, like in our popular imagination, they were just regular party hacks who sat in their nice offices, who enjoyed their party privilege. And, when the moment came, they had to stand up from the trench or from like rise from the grass and charge against German machine guns. And surprisingly enough, that's exactly what they did. Practically all of them.
Can we make some kind of an overarching comment about the Russian spirit, or is this too patriotic for you?
Well, Russian spirit.
I mean, it just sounds like an otherworldly situation, like people who are completely unprepared but still rising up to the occasion. Like you see this kind of thing in movies, but you don't really expect it to happen in real life the way you're describing it, especially not from party officials with cushy jobs compared to other people. So I know you don't like I know you don't like making these grand patriotic lessons, but it sounds like the kind of thing that you're talking about, where you show them really specific details of why this was a heroic feat. because this specific thing happened and this specific thing happened, and it was this kinds of people that were not expected to even participate in this type of a situation, but they somehow rose to the occasion. Do you think this type of scenario works better as kind of a teachable moment?
Well, in a way, but this is also a very specific type of heroism, which is explored very little, because people think of heroism as some kind of high military professionalism. But this is where we could fall, like the people who promote this idea. And in the Soviet times, it was also, heroism was presented with like exterminating the greatest number of enemies, or like something like this. This way we could easily fall in a trap, because in terms of pure military professionalism, the Germans, especially the ones that these volunteers, as well contrasted with these volunteers, the Germans were much more professional.
Of course.
And well, it's not a football. You know, some people root for certain football teams which seem more professional to them. It's like, I root for the winner. Everybody likes a good winner.
Right.
Technically, in terms of pure battlefield experience, these like untrained volunteers were not winners. Right. Because all theirs is to fight and die, you know. Mm-hmm. But in terms of spirits, there was one passage from one of my most favorite Russian writers and thinkers, Konstantin Leontiev, who wrote about ancient Greeks and ancient Persians. And he said that, traditionally, everybody sees ancient Greeks as heroes, while the ancient Persians as villains, because the ancient Greeks wrote the history that we study, and they were kind of more progressive because they gave birth to philosophy and democracy and everything. But if you look at the spirits, there are lots of things that are overlooked when you speak about ancient Persians, because this is the quotes that Leontiev brought up from the history of the Greek-Persian War. When a terrible storm started in the Aegean Sea, the Persian king had to, was about the ship of the Persian king was about to get wrecked, and in order to save the ship, it had to be made lighter, and the only way it had to be made lighter was by getting rid of extra people on board. And then the Persian officials who enjoyed life, like all this nice life, calmly and silently approached the king, bowed to him, and jumped off the ship. And this is what, without any hesitation, they just sacrificed their lives. I mean, of course, it was like a different situation, but this ability to sacrifice your life for a cause willingly and with full understanding that's what is happening. So it's not just being like a dumb sheep, like that is being led to slaughter, but knowing that they had no chance against the Germans, just to surge towards their positions without the slightest thought. Of course, there were some deserters, and they were mentioned. Of course, in the Soviet times, that they didn't mention them, and there were quite a few of them. But there were others who just charged, and most of them were these party officials who just had to show an example to the rest of the soldiers, to the rest of the volunteers. And well, that's basically what's kind of what was so inspiring to me, and what was so I don't know, maybe instructive to me. Maybe it was something that goes beyond the regular understanding of patriotism, you know.
Exactly, it's completely. It's just so difficult to imagine in today's day and age. I mean, of course, we see conflict zones, and you know, we can look on Donbass and certain acts of heroism there as well. But for people who are not living in conflict zones, who are living, right, a much more comfortable lifestyle despite inflation and all this other stuff that we're facing, it's just very difficult to even put yourself into that mindset. So what do you think was the cause from their perspective? Was it just the sheer survival of the people? What was the cause that made these party officials with cushy jobs get up and self-sacrifice?
Well, I think it was everything in the mix, because of course there was certain propaganda, there was things that people were raised with, but it was also the defense of their native lands that pushed people towards such feats.
It's much more visceral, right? Like that's much more visceral, because people, like you said, people like to, anti-communists like to talk about that they're so thoroughly brainwashed that they're doing it purely for the state, or something along those lines. Whereas, like you're saying, this visceral defense of the land, right, of your people is much more understandable in that context, even for party officials with normally cushy jobs compared to everyone else. So, what do you think, Marcelo?
Yeah, well, we are reaching 1.5 hours, so I would.
Yeah, I think and it's getting late in Europe and in St. Petersburg. So
yeah, especially St. Petersburg. So I have a question that I wanted to do, and maybe to wrap this up a little bit, but it's not exactly about history. It's not about the Leningrad siege. Sometimes words misses, and it's
when
it's
Russian
more
would say
personal.
blockade, and I always want to say it's a blockade, and I have to remind myself it's a siege in English, even though I live in an English-speaking environment. So
exactly, but it's something more nowadays, and I want to hear from you, Alexander, your perspective, your perception. Your personal perception and what you see from the average Russian, well, the people that you know, your friends, and the people that you hear about modern times situations in Ukraine, and all this Western Russophobia that is trying to be punched down our throats. So I would like to hear from you this a little bit.
That's quite a question. Well, basically, I've been rooting for supporting Donbass since 2014, and I've been watching this situation intensely. And then things got kind of more or less quiet, and then suddenly, like a storm out of the blue, the whole thing started in February of 2022. It was a bit of a shocker for me, because personally I expected the Russian army to encircle the Ukrainian grouping around Donbass, just to completely eliminate the forces that were shelling Donbass. And I think had they only concentrated on that, they could have succeeded. But frankly, I've been studying military history for a long time, but I still cannot comprehend the general strategy and tactics of the Russian army that it used in the first months of the invasion. It defies comprehension, because from the military point of view, it was very strange. Let's put it this way. But that's speaking of the pure military thing. So I wanted Donbass to be free from the bombings and shellings of the Ukrainian army. And what happened next was completely unpredictable. The generals always prepare for the past, for the war of the past, where they can never look into the future. And this is what happens time over time. And I guess this is part of the human mentality. And speaking of the Russophobia, it's always been there naturally, and I think there's a certain parallel with the war against Finland in 1939, because the Soviet Union was negotiating for the territory that was actually meant to be kind of negotiated back in Lenin's times. There's a long story going behind this disputed territory with Finland that goes back to the days of Alexander I and then Lenin and everything. But speaking of Ukraine, nobody cared about in the West, nobody cared about the complexity of this conflict. everybody had this knee-jerk reaction that the big bad bear of Russia, which is so backwards, is so Asiatic. They don't say that, but it's there. And which is so which wants to trample the young, beautiful Ukrainian democracy, which is neither beautiful nor democracy, especially, and
Nor young.
well, you just can't really do anything about that because this is the way it is. They want to believe that, and when a person really wants to believe that, it's like talking to flat earthers. It's their creeds. It's all. If you can't even make a dent into it, because once you make a dent, it's like a crack in a dam. It will just start like crumbling. And I lost a lot of friends, both in Russia and in the West, because I used to hang out with a lot of people who were very critical about the Russian government, and I'm still pretty critical, towards the Russian government. But this is where our ways parted, when these people started saying like, no, Russia has to be crushed. It's an imperialist aggressor, blah, blah, blah. And of course, that's pretty different from what I think. I lost Russian friends and I lost foreign friends as well. But, well, that's the way it is.
Here's the diversity of Russian opinions that I tell you about Marcelo. He is a person who can be critical of the Russian government in certain ways, but at the same time, there is a particular convergence, right, when it comes to life and death situations like the survival of Donbass.
That should be the reasoning way of thinking. I mean, you can, of course, by being in favor of something that it's kind of patriotic way of thinking doesn't mean you love the Putin. Doesn't mean his government. His government is perfect. You don't need to. You can't be. Well, I had some experience with foreigners some time ago that from a country that's very rich, very developed, and I've been there, and they were complaining about the roads could be better. If we were not sending this money to this country, the roads could be better. Well, the roads were great, but can be better. They have money to have better. So they could be critical of the governments, even having a very good condition. And if you look around and you see that it could be better.
Which is a healthy perception, right? You shouldn't be completely accepting everything, but at the same time, like I said, there are certain situations where you can surpass your criticism on certain issues and understand the greater context where you can have that convergence with especially the situation in Donbass since 2014. So, and to me, it's just so interesting. It's like, Alexander is saying that people are convinced of something. They're not going to be unconvinced of it, so to speak, with just your argument. And I know that I've been posting about Donbass since the Maidan started, and I have this, and I don't delete my tweets, so I have this full record of stuff that you can search on my X/Twitter, and people come to me and tell me that the whole conflict is fake and that it's not documented, even though, I'm personally, I have been talking about it for now almost a decade, which is kind of a scary number to really think about of how long that's been going on. So yeah, I think that's another dimension to it, but yeah.
Well, I would say that we have utterly exceeded the time that we had decided to go for this show.
I apologize for my questions. The Winter Latinas are very verbose, as you know, so we have to keep talking. But yes, now I think this was a really, to me, a very educational episode. Like I said, I have advanced graduate degrees in history, and there's a lot of information that I do not know. So I like learning from Alexander. I think everyone should follow his Telegram, where he posts about this type of information that is really not easily accessible, especially in English, but sometimes in Russian too.
So Alexander, do you want to say some final words and where people find you? I have put all the links on the description. I will check if Nina have put on her videos as well. Anyway, I just copy and paste for you. Do you want to, say some final words here first?
Well, I don't know, like there's my website, now I can see it's written just under my name, and that's where I occasionally upload articles in English, but I practically gave up my English part of the website, focusing on the Russian side, because this is the kind of tourist I work right now. I do like work with Russian-speaking tourists. Maybe sometime later, I will not just sometime later. Maybe I will occasionally post certain things in English. But there's already a pretty significant volume of articles, not so much articles, but translations of memoirs or diary entries of siege survivors, and you can just I think that there's about 100 or more than 100 of them, and normally they're complemented with now and then pictures of Leningrad during the siege. And these pictures, I try to choose a fitting picture to match with the story that I post.
And you take a lot of them yourself, right? I think you should clarify that you personally go to these places, and then you find historical images from World War II, and then you contrast the two side by side, which is other people have done, but the amount of documentation that Alexander has done is really amazing for really specific type of content.
So Nina, you want some final words?
Thank you for checking out the first of hopefully many, many episodes of the Winter Latina Show. Thank you for Alexander for providing amazing expertise today, and thank you, Marcelo, for being the brains behind this show. Where I think everything went wrong. I'm just the talking. That's okay. I think it's I don't want to translate Russian expressions, but our expression is that the first pancake or the first crepe is messed up, but then the next one is fine. So hopefully this one isn't too messed up. But you're definitely the brains behind this, the technical support. So I really appreciate all that you've put into this, and we look forward to seeing everyone who's tuned in and will tune in maybe as a recording in next week. Thank you, guys.
And so remember that all the social and links are in the description. Remember to like, share, subscribe, all the things that Mr. Musk loves. And there we go. See you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.